Hello and welcome to the Record of Arms. I'm your host Mark 7. This is my first episode, so it's a real pleasure to have you here. In this one, I'm going to be taking a look at an aircraft from the Second World War, its design and development, and an overview of its employment during that conflict. This one should set the tone for what will come to follow, and there'll be some substantial variation in subject matter. In the interest of disclosure, I want to make it clear right away that I have no credentials of any kind. I'm not any kind of professional historian. I have an undergraduate degree in history from the University of Missouri, but I studied different topics there, and in any case it hardly qualifies me as any kind of expert. My knowledge of military history is derived entirely from my own reading as a result of a lifelong interest in this kind of thing. It goes back all the way to my pre-kindergarten years, when my family would take me to the library in our neighborhood and I'd go get picture books about the Battle of Britain or whatever. But that's really it as far as any qualifications I might have. I'll be drawing my information from two major sources for this episode. First is the book Messerschmitt Bf-110 Zerstorer Aces of World War II by John Wheel. This is my source for the operational history of the aircraft as well as information on its design and development. The other book I'm using is Wings of the Luftwaffe by Captain Eric Brown of the British Royal Navy. This book gives detailed information on the flying characteristics and design details of the 110 from the viewpoint of a pilot who flew captured examples during the war. With that preliminary exposition out of the way, let's begin our look at the 110 with a bit of background on the kind of strategic thinking that went into creating it. In the years between the wars, the advance of technology led many military thinkers to theorize that the next war would be, above all, an air war. Strategic thinking of the day often visualized the next war starting with massed fleets of bombers flying over the home territories of the belligerents, and laying waste to the cities and war industries, devastating the entirety of the nation, dislocating economic and social organization, and terrorizing the civilian population into surrender. Really apocalyptic scenarios of total destruction were thought to be likely, probably very similar to those familiar in another context to anyone who grew up during the Cold War. I remember thoroughly believing that if a nuclear war broke out, that was just it for civilization, and the next day it would be like Mad Max. To the people of the 1920s and 30s, very similar ideas were circulated about regular non-nuclear aerial bombardment. Of course, these fears turned out to be overblown. The world's combined air forces at the time of the outbreak of the Second World War had nothing like this amount of destructive potential. Nonetheless, these were the ideas that were floating around at the time. One important part of this idea of air power was a strategic fighter capable of protecting these fleets of bombers from the intercepting fighter aircraft of the target nation. These strategic fighters would be sent along with the bombers to destroy enemy fighters, allowing the bombers to accomplish their mission and eventually eliminating enemy aerial resistance by attrition. With the enemy's air force rendered impotent, it would establish their air supremacy and would allow the bombers freedom to devastate the enemy's territory. Such a fighter would have to be large in order to carry the fuel needed to achieve the range necessary for the job. Given the aircraft technology of the day, this would mean a twin-engined aircraft, larger than was usual for fighters. Large, heavy aircraft of the kind imagined would probably not be as agile as the smaller fighters it would likely be facing, so it would need to rely on superior speed and heavy armament in order to prevail. The problem for a less nimble plane in combat is that if your opponent can turn more quickly than you, it's much easier for them to get into a firing position on your tail and much more difficult for you to get into a similar position on them. Faster aircraft to negate a more maneuverable but slower opponent's advantage, dogfight by declining to become involved in such a battle, and using their fighter's superior speed to make firing passes on the enemy machine, then withdraw out of range. The faster fighter can then come around for another attack, or if necessary break off the action entirely. A faster plane, therefore, has the vital advantage of being able to decline combat or to prevent the enemy from disengaging. Heavy firepower complements the tactics of speed by providing the ability to deal a lethal blow with the shorter bursts of fire made necessary by the often very high closing speeds of the opponents. Though this idea was discussed and experimented with in various countries, the Luftwaffe would prove to be the only air force which created a major role for a strategic heavy fighter. In 1934, the German Air Ministry issued a requirement to German industry for a twin-engine heavy fighter. The requirement specified a two-seater machine with 20mm cannon armament, capable of at least 400 km per hour, or about 250 miles an hour, with a range of 2,000 kilometers, or about 1,250 miles. In German terminology, such an aircraft was called a Zerstorer, later shortened to just Zerstorer, which translates to destroyer. This term has its roots in naval usage, and naval destroyers were originally intended to protect the major units of an ocean-going fleet from smaller, more agile threats like torpedo boats, which the heavy ordnance of the big ships had trouble hitting. In like manner, the aerial Zerstorers would protect the heavy hitters of the air fleet from the swarms of smaller fighters that would otherwise be able to endanger them. Though this term was in current usage around this time, the official change in terminology from Schwerjäger, or heavy fighter, to Zerstorer would not take place until May 1939. In 1937, the Luftwaffe institutionalized its recognition of these two distinct fighter roles, that of short-range interceptor and large strategic fighter, by reorganization of the new fighter arm into light and heavy fighter units. When this occurred, both types were equipped with the same model of single-engine aircraft, early marks of the Bf-110. Of the existing fighter groups of the Air Force, 7 were designated as heavy fighters at this time. Each group was composed of 3 squadrons, each with 10 to 12 aircraft. Typically, 3 such groups would be organized into a Geschwader, the equivalent of a wing in the U.S. or British Air Forces. Though the exact composition of these Geschwader would vary, a normal 3-group Geschwader would field about 100 aircraft altogether. Along with similar units of single-engine fighters, medium bombers, and dive bombers, these heavy fighter wings would represent one of the principal weapons of the new Air Force. For operational purposes, these wings would be subordinated to the air fleets, or Luftflotten. An 8th heavy fighter group was employed in a special tactical evaluation formation. This was called the Lehrgeschwader, and it performed tactical and technical evaluations of new aircraft. Often, the personnel of this unit were particularly skilled or experienced men, some of them being ex-test pilots from the aircraft manufacturers, and in general this can be thought of as a type of elite of the Luftwaffe. The job was to test out prototypes of the new heavy fighters and make a determination of their suitability and tactical potential, and also to develop tactical doctrine for the employment of these aircraft in combat. It would also create the protocols to be used in training future heavy fighter crewmen. In 1939, a further 2 groups or grouping of light fighters were converted into heavy fighters. This brought the total to 10 Zerstorer groups, or about 30 squadrons in the Luftwaffe's era of battle. The light and heavy fighters were also intended to function under separate chains of command, suited their different tasks. The light groups were placed under the command of the territorial administrative entities of the Luftwaffe. These were known as Luftgau. They were responsible for the administrative and logistical services within their districts, as well as for their air defense. The light fighter groups, being composed of short-range interceptors intended for air defense purposes, naturally came under these commands. The heavy fighter units, on the other hand, were part of the operational air fleets attached to the armies and were to be primarily employed in offensive operations over enemy territory. Despite the difference in mission conception, both types of fighter squadrons were, for the time being, to use the same model of aircraft. Despite the 1934 requirement for a twin-engine type to fill the heavy fighter role, German industry had yet to produce a satisfactory machine. The Bf-109, intended to fill the short-range interceptor role, would be standard equipment for both types of formation from 1937 until the introduction of a suitable heavy fighter. However, the process was underway, and a suitable aircraft would not be long in coming. The aircraft, which was to become synonymous with the Luftwaffe's heavy fighter arm, the Bf-110, existed only as a prototype at the time of its establishment. Testing of the first 110, fitted with the new and temperamental Daimler-Benz DB600 series engines, commenced on the 12th of May in 1936. The evaluation program found the aircraft faster than expected, faster indeed than the B model Bf-109 then serving as the first-line fighter, though somewhat less agile than had been hoped. The 110 was chosen as the most suitable of the 3 designs submitted for evaluation, beating out the Focke-Wulf FW-57 and the Henschel HS-124. 4 pre-production models, designated Bf-110A-0, were ordered. Here I'd like to briefly explain Luftwaffe nomenclature, so as to avoid confusion concerning the various subtypes I'll be discussing. An aircraft designation begins with a letter prefix, in this case Bf, which indicates the manufacturer, or sometimes the designer of the machine. In this case, Bf indicates Bayerische Flugzeugwerke, the aviation division of BMW. A number follows indicating the design series number in that manufacturer's succession of designs. Following the number is a letter suffix which denotes the particular model of that design. Usually this begins with A, and as successive upgrades or specializations are made to the basic design, these suffix letters progress to B, C, D, and so on. A new model letter indicates a significant change to the design, such as a different engine or some other major system, or a specialization of one kind or another. Variants of these models are then designated by a number after the dash. These variants are generally either minor upgrades or variations on the base model optimized for a specific purpose. For example, the C-1 might be the base fighter version of a C-model aircraft, C-2 might be a reconnaissance version, the C-3 identical to the C-1 except for a redesigned canopy, the C-4 a trainer version, and so on. To return to the 110, prototype testing began to get underway. However, this revealed serious reliability issues with the DB-601 engine. This was not an uncommon occurrence, as the development of an aircraft engine was usually as complicated and time-consuming a process as that of the aircraft itself, sometimes more so. This was a difficulty encountered by all nations, but the Germans labored under the additional handicap of the Versailles Treaty, which placed strict limits on the development of aircraft power plants. Though these restraints were ignored after Hitler came to power, the German aero-engine industry was considerably behind the state-of-the-art in other countries, which had continued unrestricted development in this area since the end of the First World War. The only three firms capable of producing military engines in quantity, which were Junkers, Daimler-Benz, and BMW, were comparatively small in production capacity and lacked experience in design and mass production of high-performance engines. Though they made up a lot of ground in the years since 1933, when the Versailles restrictions were set aside, German engine manufacture was plagued with difficulties and lags in production, and the DB600 series engine used in the new fighter is no exception. As a result, manufacturers were compelled to complete the aircraft using substitute engines. These were Junkers UMO-210Bs. While these engines were adequate to get the plane into the air, they left it seriously underpowered and severely compromised its combat potential. The first Bf-110A-0 was delivered in January of 1937. It proved to be capable of only 268 miles per hour, almost 80 miles per hour slower than the prototype had been. Nevertheless, the aircraft proved very promising, and the developmental difficulties of the engine were projected to be overcome in due course. The Bf-110 was ordered into full production on the personal orders of the head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, who was particularly convinced of the usefulness of this new plane. Manufacture would commence at a slow pace, with the initial models using the UMO-210 engine. Full-scale production would be initiated once the DB601 engine finished its teething troubles and became available. The 110 was a two-seater, twin-engine, all-metal monoplane with a slim fuselage and clean lines. The crew sat one behind the other in a long greenhouse-type canopy. A heavy gun armament, usually consisting of a pair of 20mm automatic cannon and four 7.92mm machine guns, was grouped together in the nose with a single machine gun mounted on a trainable mount in the rear cockpit. The wings were thick and wide at the root and tapered along their span, and ended in squared-off tips. They had a wide span and a comparatively narrow chord throughout most of their length. The tailplane was on similar lines and carried two vertical stabilizers. Landing gear was conventional in arrangement, with the main members retracting into engine nacelles. The tailwheel was not steerable. Instead, ground maneuvering was accomplished by differential braking on the main wheels. The 110 normally carried a crew of two men, a pilot and radio operator/gunner in the rear seat. This backseater, or Bordfunker as he was called, also assisted in navigation and the operation of reconnaissance equipment or radar gear in 110s that carried it. Some 110s carried a third crewman, called a Bordmechaniker. These three-man planes were usually night fighter variants, and the extra man was there to operate the radar set and other specialized electronics used for night interceptions. The crew entered the aircraft by means of a specially designed ladder, and swung the upper portion of the Perspex canopy back while folding the side panels downwards. The crew was supplied with bottled oxygen for use at high altitudes, which was fed from a compartment halfway down the fuselage behind the cabin. A prominent radio mast projected from the center of the cockpit canopy, trailing aerial wires back to the tips of both tail fins. Protection was limited to an armor glass windscreen, relatively thin armor plates at the front and the floor of the cockpit and the backs of the crew's seats, as well as a plate at the nose of each engine nacelle protecting the engine. The plane's overall structure was durable and strongly constructed. Flaps and brakes were actuated by a conventional hydraulic system, and aside from the automatically acting leading edge slats, so was the rest of the control system. The engines were housed in wing nacelles close to the fuselage. The DB601 engine was an inverted V12 unit capable of 1,050 horsepower. The UMO-210 substitutes were a similar arrangement but developed only 700 horsepower, which accounts for the performance deficit of the B model. The nacelles were smoothly rounded, and the engines drove three-bladed VDM air screws capped with rounded conical spinners very similar to those used on the 109. Fuel was stored in four tanks, two in each wing just outboard of the fuselage. Each wing held a 375-liter or 182.4-gallon main tank and a 260-liter 57-gallon reserve tank. Transfer of fuel between tanks could be accomplished by means of a hand pump. Handling, both on the ground and in the air, was described as good. The controls were well-balanced and responsive, but became progressively heavier at higher speeds. The plane was surprisingly agile for such a large fighter, but was handicapped in tight turns by the operation of the automatic slats. When these would engage, the resulting wobble would make accurate firing a real challenge. This was a drawback it shared with the 109. The plane flew reasonably well on one engine, but had a hard time landing in this condition as the dead engine would create controllability issues when the flaps were fully extended. A British pilot who evaluated the performance of the captured 110 compared the German plane's performance to its nearest British analog, which he judged to be the Bristol Beaufighter. He rated the 110 as having a significant edge over the British machine, especially in terms of maneuverability. The initial production models using the UMO engine were designated Bf-110Bs. As expected, the performance of this particular model was less than that of the initial DB engine prototypes. Production was therefore carried forward at a relatively slow pace, and only 45 were built between mid-1937 and mid-1938, when the DB601 engine became available and use of the UMO 210G was discontinued. Despite the low numbers produced, there were three variants of the B model. The regular fighter variant, the B-1, was armed with two 20mm MG-FF automatic cannon and four 7.92mm MG-17 machine guns in the nose, and a single MG-15 of the same caliber in the rear cockpit. Small numbers of a recon version, the B-2, and a trainer, the B-3, were also produced. These two variants omitted the cannon armament in favor of their role-specific equipment. With the DB engine cleared for series production, the Bf-110 was at last ready for production at its intended highest priority rate. The new model was designated the Bf-110C and was called the Caesar by its crews. Production began in earnest not only at the BFW works, but also at the Focke-Wulf and Gotha factories. The new DB601A engines developed 1,050 horsepower each, and the promise of the initial prototype was fulfilled in the new fighter's performance. The plane achieved a best speed of 350 miles per hour, or about 563 kph, at 19,685 feet, or 6,000 meters, and could climb this altitude in just a little over 10 minutes. Service ceiling was a little less than 33,000 feet, or just over 10,000 meters, a range at cruising speed better than 500 miles, and more than 800 kilometers. The C-1, the initial production variant, became the first 110 produced in large numbers. Successive upgraded models C-2 through C-4 would see the installation of improved radio equipment and the replacement of the MG-FF automatic cannon with the newer MG-FF-M model. C-4 added additional pilot armor and had a sub-variant, the C-4/B, which is the first fighter-bomber version of the 110, with racks for two 250-kilogram bombs. This fighter-bomber, or YABO, mission would become an important part of the 110's wartime employment. As in the B series, there would also be a reconnaissance version omitting the cannon armament, and this was known as the C-5. An experimental model was produced, the C-6, which had its cannon armament augmented by a 30mm Mk-101 mounted on the underside of the fuselage. A more capable YABO version, the C-7, expanded the capability of the fighter-bomber C-4/B with the provision of new bomb racks which accommodate larger individual bombs up to 1,000 kilograms in size. The first of these high-performance heavy fighters were delivered to the 1st Heavy Fighter Squadron of the Lehrgeschwader in January of 1939. Other heavy fighter wings, or Zerstorer, abbreviated ZG, would receive these aircraft in the subsequent spring and early summer, beginning with ZG-1 and ZG-26. These would serve alongside and eventually replace the B models as more of the new planes became available. These three Zerstorer grouping, totaling 9 squadrons and associated units, had between them 90 to 100 of both B and C model 110s. These would be the only units in the heavy fighter arm to be so equipped at the time of the outbreak of the war. The remainder would still be flying various marks of the 109. The B models would be expended or replaced in the campaigns of 1939 and 1940. The Bf-110C would be by far the most commonly encountered model in the early campaigns of the war. Polish and Scandinavian campaigns were fought using C models with a dwindling number of remaining B models. A small number of 110 equipped Zerstorer groups fighting in these campaigns enjoyed success in their design role. The resistance offered in the air by the Polish and Norwegian air forces, or by the RAF and Fleet Air Arm pilots they would also encounter at this stage in the war, was composed mainly of obsolescent types or fighters that had been competitive in the early 1930s. Formations of 110s escorted bombers, or in some cases airborne troops, into enemy territory and engaged the enemy in the air. In conjunction with the 109s, they established superiority in the air and drove enemy air forces from the skies, or at least rendered them incapable of interfering with the German effort. Once the Zerstorers ran out of targets in the air, they were used in low-level attacks against enemy ground troops and installations, developing something of a specialization in train-busting attacks. The 110 was found to be most suitable for this type of action, being faster, tougher, and more agile than the dedicated bomber aircraft. Its 20mm cannon armament proved deadly to troops and equipment on the ground, and the plane proved itself capable of shallow-angle dive bombing attacks. In the initial campaigns of the war, the Zerstorer concept seemed to have proven itself, and the 110 was found to excel in missions well beyond the scope of its intended role. By the time of the invasion of France in 1940, enough 110Cs had been produced to finally replace all the Bf-109s serving in Zerstorer units. For this campaign, in the battles over England to follow, all Zerstorer units would be flying the Bf-110C, or in some cases, a newer and more specialized model. This was the Bf-110D, which is a long-range machine produced after the experience of the Norwegian campaign, where the distances traveled sometimes caused the 110s to have too little flexibility in terms of what they could do if unexpected circumstances led to unanticipated fuel consumption. Also, these longer-range 110s were more useful in the maritime patrol and convoy protection missions, which would be called upon to perform now that the German territory included areas with extensive coastlines. An initial variant of the new D model was an improvised solution to the problems encountered in Norway. On these planes, known as D1s or D0s sometimes, the extended range was accomplished by the addition of a large fuel tank to the underside of the fuselage beneath the crew compartment. This was enclosed by a streamlined wooden fairing. This tank was very large and changed the plane's outline quite a bit. In addition, the weight of more than 1,000 liters of fuel degraded the aircraft's performance significantly. The tank created a massive bulge under the fuselage that slowed the plane down and created handling problems as the tank emptied and the remaining fuel sloshed around in the big tank, shifting the aircraft's center of gravity in unpredictable ways. Even more alarmingly, some pilots claimed that the tank leaked gas fumes into the crew compartment, creating an explosion hazard. Enough of these aircraft were converted to equip some of the units taking part in long-distance missions to the area around Narvik in the later stages of the Norwegian campaign. But it was really just the fact that their opposition was not state-of-the-art and fully organized that saved these converted 110Ds from a probable massacre. A better solution was found in the need for additional fuel storage in later marks of the D1 model, where the cumbersome and hazardous ventral tank was replaced by wing hardpoints capable of receiving large drop tanks, carrying the additional fuel in a more balanced way that had less effect on the handling and allowing the fighter to jettison the encumbrance if necessary. The following D2 model added the option to carry smaller drop tanks along with two 500-kilogram bombs. The final D variant, the D3, reflects the changing nature of the missions the 110s found themselves carrying out. This was a specialized maritime patrol/convoy escort version, where you could carry drop tanks or bombs but also had a two-man life raft stowed in the fuselage, in case the crew was forced to ditch and await rescue while operating over water. The extra endurance in the air also recommended the D model the night fighter arm of the Luftwaffe. The 110 had shown real promise as a night fighter, as the dire need for such a defense became apparent earlier in the war. In this role, the loss in performance caused by the extra fuel was more than compensated for by the ability to stay in the air for a longer time. Hundreds of Bf-110Ds were to specialize in this night fighter role, many being fitted with early airborne radar sets or primitive infrared imaging gear. Bf-110Ds took part in the French campaign, but a large proportion of these planes were stationed in Scandinavia where they concentrated on convoy escort duties, or were being drawn into the new and growing night fighter formations. Overall, the Zerstorer units did well in the fighting in France, though they found themselves running into problems when confronting the more modern machines of the French Armée de l'Air and the British RAF. Spitfire in particular proved a very deadly opponent, and 110 losses were higher in proportion to their sortie rate than had been the case in the earlier campaigns. Nonetheless, the Zerstorer seemed to once again have succeeded in establishing a real niche for itself in the new kind of warfare being fought in the air above Europe and over the surrounding waters. As they had before, the 110s escorted medium bomber raids and performed fighter sweeps of the 109s. Once the enemy's opposition in the air was broken, they were sent on frequent strafing and bombing missions against the Allies' ground forces and logistical services. The long-range converted D models based in Norway were mauled early in the main phase of the Battle of Britain on the one strike they mounted across the North Sea towards the northern UK. In this action, the fears that had been expressed about the fat-bellied D1 models had proven to be fully justified. 7 of the 21 employed were lost. At least one was known to have been destroyed by an explosion of the vapor-filled belly tank. It was not only Zerstowers flying from Norway which fared badly this day. August 15th, the day of the Cross North Sea strike, was right at the height of the Battle of Britain, and on this day a total of 30 110s were lost in action, either shot down or so badly damaged that they were rendered unusable. This was the equivalent of 3 full squadrons. And though it is not as one-sided as is sometimes portrayed, the problems which became noticeable in France reached prohibitive proportions in England. The basic problem was that against a state-of-the-art fighter like the Spitfire, which had not been committed in previous campaigns, the 110 did not possess the advantages of speed and firepower that would enable it to engage the enemy plane with a realistic hope of success. For one, all the new British fighters had an armament of 8 .303 caliber machine guns, which may or may not be considered heavier than that carried by the 110, but was definitely sufficient to shred the Zerstorer without too much trouble. In terms of performance, when compared with the less capable British frontline fighters like the Hurricane and the carrier-borne Fulmar, which it had already faced, the 110's agility was not that bad, and the machine would often have a speed and energy advantage. Bf-110C could even outclimb most early marks of the Hurricane. Against these planes, then, the 110 would usually be at a disadvantage, although not at a decisive one, and good piloting and tactics could usually make the fight pretty even. Against the Spitfire, though, the twin-engine Zerstorer was hopelessly clumsy and too slow to escape. Faced with this kind of first-class opposition, the 110's only defense was to form defensive circles. This tactic, a resurrection of the Great War-era Luftwaffe circles, created a situation in which an attacker could not get on the tail of one heavy fighter without having another immediately behind it. Though this had been used by the 110's before, it was used much more commonly in combat against the more formidable British fighters. In particularly bad situations, it was even known for the aircraft to proceed towards their targets in a defensive circle, with the circle itself as a whole progressing slowly towards the target. Though this was often done to deal with superior opposition, defensive circle would also be used for less obvious purposes. A big circle of whirling aircraft attracts a lot of attention, and proved to be useful for drawing attacks away from German bombers. Sometimes, a defensive circle of 110's would be used as bait to attract RAF fighters into an ambush by 109's waiting at a higher altitude. As a pure defense, however, the circle was inadequate. The Bf-110 simply could not protect itself in such an aerial environment against modern single-engine fighters. This would be the conclusion of the Luftwaffe command itself, however, and the 110's would fly missions over England in diminishing numbers all throughout the daylight phase of the battle. Zerstorer units would disappear from the order of battle one by one, not due to the withdrawal orders, but due to extreme losses and depletion. More and more Zerstorer formations were deactivated due to such serious losses, and the remaining men and machines dispersed among the night fighter units or the fighter-bomber formations. Some of these disbanded Zerstorer units would be reconstituted later in the war, but in another capacity. It would seem that in order for the Zerstorer concept to be viable, it would have to have at least some kind of tactical edge to be able to protect the bombers in itself. Against an efficient, organized air defense using top-of-the-line single-seat fighters, the heavy fighters had no edge at all and could only expect heavy losses. The numbers here reveal the extent of the problem. The Germans began the battle with 237 110's participating. Losses totaled no fewer than 223. The air battle over southeastern England was exactly the kind of strategic air campaign that had been envisioned in the minds of the pre-war air power theorists. It was the exact kind of battle in which the 110 was meant to fulfill a vital role. The failure of the 110 in this campaign marked the end of its usefulness in daylight in the West. From now on, the aircraft would be usefully employed only on missions in the course of which they could expect no opposition from modern single-seat fighters, or in theaters where these opponents were not to be found. This was a similarity between the career of the 110 and that of the Stuka, another design of similar age, which also was exposed as basically helpless against first-class fighter opposition in this campaign. There would be no real large-scale employment of Zerstorer formations after the Battle of Britain. Some still fought in their original role. Heavy fighters were used successfully in their original role in the campaigns in Greece and in the attack on Crete. Small numbers flew with the Luftwaffe contingent supporting Rommel's forces in Africa. A squadron of 110's was even lent to a separatist nationalist organization in Iraq to attempt to support an uprising there against British rule. All these operations, however, were, like the maritime role, undertaken in an air environment which was much more benign, and critically, where it was unlikely that they would be up against Spitfires or equivalent high-performance fighters. The day of Zerstorer was over, and the enormous concentration of armed force that was gathered for the invasion of Russia, only two Zerstorer groups, the first and second groups of ZG-26, took part, along with 2 or 3 squadrons flying as part of other formations such as Lehrgeschwader. This was a smaller force in absolute terms than had been employed in the much smaller attack on Poland, and represented only 2% of the Luftwaffe's order of battle. The existence of any Zerstorer units at all was the result of wartime necessity rather than planning. The 2 Zerstorer groups had been in the process of conversion to night fighter duty, like most of the rest of the force, when the unexpected need for the Luftwaffe force to fight in the Balkans sent them there. Short time remaining before the planned attack on Russia saw these units, still untrained for night fighting, retained in their strategic fighter and ground attack role and attached to the air fleets massing for the new offensive. As a result of this contingency, ZG-26 would never be deactivated and remained the only Zerstorer wing to serve continuously from 1937 through the entire run of the Luftwaffe's effective lifetime. Although the Battle of Britain had ended the career of the aircraft as a daylight strategic fighter in the West, another purpose for which the 110 proved particularly well suited had revealed itself, and a great number of the now unemployed Zerstorer crewmen and aircraft were transferred to the growing night fighter force. The characteristics of the 110 made it perfect for this role, and its service in this role would become perhaps the 110's biggest contribution to Germany's war effort. The story of the war in the night sky over Germany is really one of the great stories of the war, and will be covered in the last part of this series. In the meantime, two new upgraded versions of the 110 were produced, the E and F models. The E-1 appeared in the spring of 1941 and featured newer, more powerful DB601 engines, which developed 1,150 horsepower each. This allowed an increased bomb carrying capacity, with 4 racks under the wings in addition to a pair on the center line. Some examples of the E were fitted with infrared detection gear and specialized in the night fighting role. In some cases, provision for a third crewman was made to operate electronic gear such as radar, which was becoming available to equip these aircraft. An E-2 was built that was identical to the E-1 except for minor design and equipment updates, and an E-3 reconnaissance variant which was built without the cannon or the centerline bomb racks. The production run of the E model was short, as the improved F model began to enter service in the summer of 1941. This version of the 110 was fitted with the 1,350 horsepower DB601F, and the extra power gave a real boost in the machine's performance. In addition, the option to carry drop tanks became standard on the F model, and the pilot's protection was augmented by a thicker armored windscreen. The standard F1 was equipped with 4 bomb racks on the wings and 1 on the centerline. The F2 was an anticipation of what the heavy fighter role would mean in the years of mass daylight bombing of Germany. This was a bomber-destroyer model without provision for a bomb load, but equipped to carry 4 heavy 21-centimeter unguided air-to-air rockets. This version was slightly faster than the F1 as well. As usual, a recon version was built without the cannon, and this was the F3. The F4 was the first 110 specifically designed for the night fighter role. Delays in the development of the radar it was meant to carry meant it didn't enter the battle until 1942, but from then on it became the standard night fighter until later aircraft would replace it in 1943. Some F4s were built with the second crewman's position replaced by a pair of upward-firing 20mm cannon in an arrangement known as Schraga music. These were known as F4-U1s. As the English bombers that were the main opponent of the night fighters had no weapons capable of firing directly below the bomber, a 110 carrying this unique weapon system could put itself below a bomber and fire in safety into the bomber's belly, where hits on the bomb bay or the fuel tanks were likely to be deadly. In the specializations of the F model 110s, you can see the effect that the wartime experience had had on the original Zerstorer idea. 2 of the 3 combat models were, in fact, used as heavy fighters in an air superiority role, but now they were designed to be used in the defensive rather than offensive operations. Had everything gone according to plan, the F model would have been the final 110 to have been manufactured. The aircraft's replacement, the Bf-210, was nearing the production stage and would soon replace the 110. Consequently, 110 production was halted in late 1941. However, the 210 soon revealed aerodynamic and stability problems that proved to be insuperable, and the older aircraft was put back into production after a short hiatus. This is another similarity in the careers of the 110 and the Ju-87 Stuka. 210 was also intended to be the Stuka's replacement. Its failure led to the prolongation of Ju-87 production long past what had been intended. A new model, the G, was introduced in May of 1942. This would be the most widely produced model of the 110 and was the last to reach production status. It differed from the F model chiefly by the substitution of DB605 engines for the DB601s. The airframe was significantly strengthened, which augmented the machine's toughness and also allowed it to carry heavier loads. Though it handled well when not carrying a load, it was sluggish with one, and this limited its effectiveness in the bomber-destroyer role. The different G models were the most widely produced variants of the 110, and production would continue from early 1942 until February of 1944. F model production would continue concurrently with G models for a time, as the F-1 fighter bomber was not replaced in this role by a fighter bomber G model, and the F-4 night fighter would not be replaced by a suitable G model until January 1943. G models included a G-2 heavy fighter, a G-3 reconnaissance machine, and the most successful variant, the G-4 night fighter. This last was usually a three-man machine equipped with radar. I say usually because the G models were compatible with a wide variety of field conversion kits with added radars, fuel storage, nitrous oxide boost for the engines, or a variety of weapon packages which included heavy cannon and upward-firing cannon units. Some of these kits were installed in crew positions and would reduce the number of men carried. As a result of the proliferation of these field conversion kits, Bf-110G fighters could differ greatly from aircraft to aircraft. A further variant, the Bf-110H, would have represented another incremental improvement, but was never produced. This was to have been powered by newer DB605Es and given an upgraded cannon armament. The designs included a single-seat variant, which was hoped that the weight saved by this change would go some way to alleviate the performance gap between the heavy fighter and its opponents. However, work on the new model was abandoned after the prototypes, workshops, and testing facilities were destroyed in the February 1944 American bombing raid on the Gotha Works. New Zerstorer groups would be activated, or rather old units left defunct since the aftermath of the Battle of Britain would be reconstituted in early 1942. Although these second-generation units were originally intended for use as fighter bombers on the Eastern Front, the ominous appearance of American heavy bomber formations in European skies by this point in the war suggested another use, and the two reactivated wings were retrained as dedicated bomber destroyers fighting in defense of the Luftwaffe's own territory against the fleets of B-17s and B-24s appearing in ever greater numbers in her skies. A third wing, ZG-76, would also be reactivated later and sent into action in this capacity. As mentioned above, these new Zerstorers were often equipped with a variety of field conversions with mounted heavy weapons, in some cases modified anti-tank guns, to the aircraft. These, and the rockets mentioned above, slowed the 110 down but allowed it to fire heavy ordnance into the American formations from well outside the range of their defensive machine guns. The intent was not only to destroy individual aircraft, but also to break up the tight and disciplined formations which were the bomber's best defense against the single-engine fighters, which would follow in to exploit the chaos caused by the Zerstorer's long-range bombardments. However, this was another special circumstance in which the 110s could operate without encountering the enemy's single-engine fighters. Once the Americans had solved the problem of range, and their Mustang and Thunderbolt fighters began to accompany the bombers straight through to the target, the 110s were done for, and were soon to disappear from their own skies. The final straw for the 110 in daylight battle over Germany came on March 16, 1944, when 43 110s of ZG-76 intercepted a USAAF raid on Augsburg. No fewer than 36 of these were shot down or forced to crash land. The aircraft was withdrawn from the battle at this point. Second-generation Zerstorer units were sent to quieter areas to re-equip with an improved design, the 410, or to be trained on Focke-Wulf FW-190 single-engine fighters and dispersed among the regular fighter units. A few units of 110s would continue to serve in fighter bomber and maritime patrol units, and many would fly with the night fighter arm until the final days of the war. But the story from here on to the end of the war is, like all the other branches of the German war effort, one of an increasingly difficult battle of attrition against an enemy whose strength starts at overwhelming and grows from there. Very few would survive the war, and the type was not used in any post-war air forces. The Zerstorer arm of the Luftwaffe itself lasted only a short time beyond the retirement of the 110 from its ranks. The last Zerstorer unit, the second group of ZG-76, which was flying 410s, was deactivated in November 1944 and its men dispersed among the remaining single-engine fighter units. Even the greatly improved 410, which was a direct evolution of the 110, could no longer survive in its home skies. The rest of the Luftwaffe's fighter force would be effectively destroyed not long after, leaving Germany defenseless against the fleets of US, British, and Russian aircraft filling her skies. Ironically, this would turn out to be the greatest vindication of the original concept of the Zerstorer as a bomber escort in the strategic air battle, only it was performed not by the German Air Force, but by the Americans. So that's about all for this brief overview of the career of the 110. In the next few episodes, I'll be looking in a little more detail at the 110's involvement in some of the specific campaigns in the European War. We'll begin next time with the attack on Poland, where the new aircraft would make its combat debut. So, that being said, I appreciate you all who listened and hope you join me for the next episode of The Record of Arms. Until then, this is Mark 7 wishing you all the best.